It is 8 in the morning on the 16th of April 1947. A gang of longshoremen are standing in the number 4 hold of a French cargo ship called the Grandcamp in the port of Texas City, Texas. They are stacking 100-pound paper sacks of fertilizer, and one of them notices a smell. Somewhere down between the sacks and the hull, about 8 layers deep, there is smoke. They do what anyone would do. Someone grabs a jug of drinking water and pours it in. Somebody else empties 2 fire extinguishers. It does nothing. And in 5 hours, most of the people standing on that dock will be dead. 581 people are about to die. It will be the deadliest industrial accident in the history of the United States. And it still is. But the part of this story that nobody puts on the memorial plaque is the part about who made the fertilizer. And I'm not going to tell you that yet. Welcome back to the factory record. Today, Texas City. To understand what happened on that dock, you have to go back about 2 years, to the end of the Second World War. America had spent 4 years building an explosives industry at a scale nobody had ever attempted. Enormous government-owned ordnance plants, scattered across the Midwest, turning out ammonium nitrate by the trainload. Ammonium nitrate is the workhorse of military explosives. On its own, it is not especially eager to go off. Mix it with fuel oil and set it off with a booster charge, and you get an enormously powerful, enormously cheap bomb filler. By 1945, the United States could make more of the stuff than anywhere on Earth. And then the war ended, and America was sitting on a manufacturing capacity it no longer had any use for. The plants were still there. The chemists were still there. The contracts were still there. Meanwhile, Europe was starving. The 1946 harvest had been bad. The 1947 winter had been worse, and half a continent of farmland had been fought over for 6 years. What Europe needed, urgently, was nitrogen for its soil. So somebody in Washington did the arithmetic. Ammonium nitrate is an explosive, but it is also, chemically, one of the best nitrogen fertilizers ever devised. The same molecule does both jobs. You could take the ordnance plants, change almost nothing, and start shipping food security to Europe by the boatload. It was, on paper, one of the most elegant swords into plowshares stories of the century. Here is where it starts to go wrong, and it goes wrong in a very boring, very bureaucratic way. Ammonium nitrate has a habit that makes it a nuisance to ship. It is hygroscopic, which means it pulls water out of the air. Left alone in a humid warehouse, it soaks up moisture, then dries, then soaks up more, and slowly welds itself into a solid block. Farmers cannot spread a rock, so the chemists solved it. They took the ammonium nitrate and they coated the grains, clay, to keep the particles apart, petrolatum, rosin, and paraffin wax, so each grain was sealed inside a thin skin of water-repellent coating. Now stop and think about what that coating actually is. Petrolatum is a petroleum product. Rosin is a resin. Paraffin wax is a hydrocarbon. They had taken an oxidizer, and they had wrapped every single grain of it in fuel. They had, without anybody quite framing it this way, manufactured a low-grade explosive and put it in a paper bag. The product got a name. Fertilizer-grade ammonium nitrate, or FGAN, and it went into 100-pound multi-wall paper sacks, and it went out on trains to the Gulf ports. Now the paperwork. This is the part I want you to sit with. The United States Army's own manuals listed ammonium nitrate as a high explosive. That was not a controversial position inside the Army. They had spent 4 years filling bombs with it. The United States Department of Agriculture listed it as a fertilizer, which, for shipping purposes, meant it was cargo. Ordinary, unremarkable cargo. No special handling, no restrictions on what it could be stacked next to, no requirement for anyone at the dock to be told what was in the sacks. So the same substance, at the same time, in the same government, was both a high explosive and a bag of plant food. Depending entirely on which building in Washington you asked. There was one place that noticed. The Port of Houston, about 40 miles up the coast, had looked at ammonium nitrate in 1946 and quietly banned the loading of it at their docks. They did not make a public announcement. They did not warn anybody else. They just decided they did not want it. So the traffic moved to the next port down, which was Texas City. Texas City in 1947 was a boomtown, and I mean that in the strict sense. The Depression had ended, the war had ended, and the Gulf Coast was in the middle of a petrochemical explosion. Population had roughly tripled in 10 years. The Monsanto Chemical Company had a plant right on the water making styrene, employing 574 people. Republic Oil had a refinery. There were tank farms, warehouses, and a rail yard, all crammed into the same few hundred acres of waterfront. And here is the structural thing that mattered most. Texas City did not have a port authority. There was no single body responsible for what came in, what went out, and what got stacked next to what. The docks were run by a terminal railway company. Safety was whatever each individual employer decided it was. During the war, the military had supervised the handling of dangerous cargo at ports like this one. After the war, that responsibility was supposed to transfer to the Coast Guard. The transfer was, let us say, incomplete. There were rules against smoking on the docks. Everyone smoked on the docks. A local Catholic priest, Father William Roach, had been saying for a while that the whole arrangement made him uneasy. He put it like this: "I feel like I'm sitting on a keg of dynamite." He was more right than he knew, and he was standing on the wrong side of it. The Grandcamp was a Liberty ship, 437 feet of welded steel, built in Los Angeles in 1942. Her original name was the Benjamin R. Curtis, and she had been handed over to France after the war as part of American aid. Her captain was a Frenchman named Charles de Guilbon. Her engine was in pieces at the dock, being repaired, which meant she could not move under her own power. Remember that. Loading began on the 14th of April. Around 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate had been booked for the voyage. Stacked in with it were small arms ammunition, machinery, bales of sisal twine, peanuts, tobacco, and cotton. Most of the fertilizer was already in the holds by the evening of the 15th, when rain stopped work for the night. Some of the longshoremen noticed something odd while they were handling the sacks. The bags were warm. Not hot, not smoking, just warm to the touch. Which is not what a bag of fertilizer that has been sitting in a rail car is supposed to feel like. Nobody stopped. Why would they? It was fertilizer. The morning of the 16th was clear and mild. The last 600 tons were due to go into hold number 4. The gang went down into the hold a little before 8, and that is when someone smelled the smoke. What happened over the next 72 minutes is a chain of small, reasonable decisions, each one made by a competent person, each one making the situation worse. First, the water. A gallon jug, then 2 extinguishers. Then someone lowered a fire hose down into the hold. The hose was never turned on. Captain de Guilbon stopped it. And I want to be fair to him here, because this decision is the one everybody points at, and the reasoning behind it was not stupid. Flooding a cargo hold with seawater ruins the cargo. This was a relief shipment. There was also a real fear, in a ship with her engine stripped, of taking on enough water to destabilize her at the dock. So the captain chose the other option, the one every merchant officer of that era had been trained to use. He ordered the hatches battened down, the tarpaulins pulled over, the ventilators closed, and the ship's steam smothering system switched on. Steam smothering works by displacement. You seal a compartment, you flood it with steam, the steam pushes out the oxygen, and a normal fire suffocates. On a cargo of cotton or timber, it is the correct call. It has saved a great many ships. Ammonium nitrate does not need your oxygen. It carries its own. Sealing the hold did not starve the fire of anything at all. All it did was raise the pressure and raise the temperature. In a sealed steel box, around 2,000 tons of an oxidizer that had been individually wrapped in wax. They were not putting the fire out. They were building a bomb casing around it. By 8:30, the heat coming off the deck plating was enough that the stevedores were ordered off the ship. Some of them stayed close by, moving the small arms ammunition further down the dock, because ammunition was the dangerous cargo. Everyone knew that. At 8:37, the alarm went out to the town. The Texas City Volunteer Fire Department turned out. 26 men, 4 trucks. The Republic Oil Refinery's own fire crew arrived a few minutes behind them. By about 8:45, they had hoses run out along the dock and water going onto the Grandcamp's hull, trying to cool the steel. Which was the correct response to a ship fire. It was also the reason they were all standing in exactly the wrong place. And then something happened that drew a crowd. Around 9, the pressure in Hold 4 finally blew the hatch covers off, and a column of smoke went up over the harbor. It was not black. Witnesses could not stop talking about the color afterwards. One called it a pretty gold-yellow color. Another said it was orange smoke in the morning sunlight, and that it was beautiful to see. That color is nitrogen dioxide. It is what ammonium nitrate gives off when it decomposes, and to a chemist, it is a screaming alarm. To everyone standing in Texas City that morning, It was the most extraordinary thing they had ever seen coming out of a ship. So they came to watch. Several hundred people. Dock workers on their break, people from the neighborhoods half a mile away, office staff, children on their way to school. They gathered a few hundred feet from the bow, in the sunshine, and they looked at the pretty smoke. At 9:12, the Grandcamp detonated. Not burned. Not exploded in the way a fuel tank explodes. Detonated, with a shock front moving faster than the speed of sound through the cargo, converting roughly 2,000 tons of fertilizer into gas in a fraction of a second. The ship ceased to exist. Not sank, not broke apart. 6,350 tons of steel went into the air, and some of it went supersonic. Within 2,000 feet of the dock, essentially nothing survived. The blast wave leveled around 1,000 buildings. It pushed a 15-foot wall of water out of the slip and across the dock area, which then came back. The Grandcamp had 2 anchors. The smaller one, weighing about 2 tons, was found 1.5 miles inland, sitting in a crater 10 feet deep. The larger one, 5 tons, came down half a mile away. Both of them are still there today, in memorial parks. Look up a photograph of a person standing next to one. The scale does not come across in words. 2 small aircraft were in the air over the harbor, sightseeing. Both were knocked out of the sky. In Galveston, 10 miles across the bay, roughly half the windows in the city broke. The sound was heard 150 miles away. Seismographs in Denver, Colorado, picked it up. And there is one statistic from the blast that I still do not fully understand. 112 people who were inside 500 feet of that ship lived. A few of them were standing within 70 feet of the dock. Blast waves do that. They reflect off buildings, and off the water, they fold back on themselves, and they leave pockets. 2 men standing together, one dies and one walks away with his ears ringing. There is no lesson in it. It is just how pressure moves. The 26 firefighters standing on the dock were gone instantly. All 4 of the town's fire engines were destroyed. Of the 28 men on the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department, 27 died that morning. The one who lived, Fred Dowdy, had not answered the call. At the Monsanto plant next door, the shift had just changed. 234 people were killed there, out of 574 employed. The plant's own firefighting team had been running hose reels toward the Grandcamp. Every one of them died. Then the burning cargo started coming down. Bales of sisal twine, on fire, landing across the tank farms. 7 storage tanks at the Republic refinery ruptured and burned. A warehouse full of sulfur caught and put out a fume that people miles away could taste. The whole waterfront was now on fire, and the town had no fire department left. Now, here is where the story stops being an accident. There was a second ship. The High Flyer was tied up about 600 feet from the Grandcamp. In her holds were 961 tons of ammonium nitrate and 1,800 tons of sulfur. The first explosion tore her loose from her moorings and shoved her across the harbor into a third ship, the Wilson B. Keene. Her crew stayed aboard for about an hour, then the smoke drove them off. In the afternoon, 2 men went back aboard looking for injured crewmen. They did not find any. What they found was that the High Flyer's cargo was burning. They reported it, and for several hours, nothing happened. There was no incident command, because there was no port authority, and the town's emergency services no longer existed in any organized form. The report went into a system that was not there. By about 11 that night, somebody had made the decision to move her. Tugboats came in and tried to pull the High Flyer away from the dock. Her anchor chain was cut. She would not come. She was jammed against the Wilson B. Keene, and after 2 hours of trying, at around 1 in the morning, the tugs gave up and pulled out. At 10 minutes past 1 on the morning of the 17th of April, the High Flyer exploded. Witnesses who had seen both said the second one was bigger. It destroyed the Wilson B. Keene outright. It threw one of its own propellers almost a mile inland, where it also sits in a park today. Fragments of the ship's frame came down over the town still glowing, and started a fresh round of fires. 16 hours. That is the number I keep coming back to. For 16 hours, people knew there was a burning ship full of ammonium nitrate in that harbor, and it was allowed to sit there until it went off. Nobody was in charge. That was not a failure of anybody's nerve or anybody's courage. It was a structural hole, and the hole had been there the whole time. The counting took about a month. The official figure is 581 dead, although the true number is almost certainly higher, and always will be. 405 bodies were identified. 63 were never identified at all, and they were buried together in a cemetery north of town. 113 people were listed as missing with no remains found. Some of those were the firefighters who had been standing closest to the Grand Camp. There was simply nothing left to bury. Beyond that, there were the people the Count could never reach. Merchant seamen off other ships. Day laborers hired that morning. Anyone passing through a boomtown port on an ordinary Wednesday. More than 5,000 people were injured. 1,784 were hospitalized, across 21 hospitals. Over 800 children were left orphaned or with one parent. 500 homes were destroyed, and 2,000 people were left with nowhere to live. Around $100 million of property was gone, in 1947 money, plus $500 million of oil products burned. Fires were still burning a week later. And then the survivors did something that had never been done before in American law. They sued the government of the United States. The reasoning was straightforward, and it was not a stretch. The ammonium nitrate had been manufactured at government-owned plants, to a government specification, under government supervision. The coding formula was the government's. The decision to package it in paper sacks was the government's. The decision to classify it as agricultural cargo rather than as an explosive was the government's. The decision to ship it out of an unregulated port was the government's. This was a genuinely new possibility. The Federal Tort Claims Act had been passed in 1946, the year before the explosion. For the first time in American history, a private citizen could sue the federal government for negligence the way they would sue a company. The ink was barely dry, and the first real test of it was going to be 581 bodies in a Texas port town. Roughly 8,500 claimants filed around 300 separate lawsuits. A federal judge in Texas consolidated them into a single action. The lead plaintiff was a widow named Elizabeth Dalehite. That consolidation is, by most accounts, the first mass class action in American legal history. Texas City did not just kill more people than any industrial accident before it. It invented the modern way of suing over one. In April 1950, the district court ruled for the families. The judge went through the government's conduct step by step. He found what he called blunders, mistakes, and acts of negligence. And he did not stop at one or two. He named well over 100 separate federal failures, running across manufacture, packaging, labeling, transport, storage, loading, and fire prevention. It was, for about 2 years, one of the most complete judicial condemnations of a government agency in American history. Then the government appealed. In June 1952, the Fifth Circuit reversed it. Their reasoning was that the decisions in question were policy decisions, made at a high level, about a matter of national importance, and that the courts had no business second-guessing them. And in June 1953, the Supreme Court agreed, 4-3. The case is Dalehite versus United States. And if you have ever wondered why it is so hard to sue the American federal government, this is where a lot of that starts. The Tort Claims Act has an exception in it for what it calls a discretionary function. The majority held that everything the government had done here fell inside that exception, choosing to make the fertilizer, choosing the formula, choosing the packaging, choosing to export it. All discretionary, all immune, not $1. 3 justices dissented, and one of them was Robert Jackson, who 2 years earlier had been the chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg. His dissent is short, and it is very hard to read calmly. He wrote that this was a man-made disaster, and that it was in no sense an act of God. And on the majority's reading of government immunity, he wrote that it came down to this: the king can do only little wrongs. 6 years after the explosion, 581 people, nothing. Now, I want to complicate my own story here, because the ending is not quite as clean as I have made it sound. In August 1955, Congress did what the courts would not. It passed a Private Relief Act, Public Law 378, setting up a compensation scheme outside the court system entirely. By the time the last claim was processed in 1957, 1,394 awards had been paid, totaling close to $17 million. So the money came, 8 years late, at a fraction of what a jury would have awarded, and explicitly structured so that the government never had to admit it had done anything wrong. But it came, and the handling rules changed. Ammonium nitrate is now regulated as a hazardous material with a real classification, real placarding, real quantity limits, and real separation distances. Every hazmat course taught in North America still uses Texas City as a case study. The modern American disaster response system came partly out of this too. The whole idea of a unified incident command, of one person who is unambiguously in charge of a scene, that grew out of what did not exist in that harbor on the 16th of April. So the deaths bought something. They usually do. That is not the same as saying they were paid for. There is a smaller detail from that spring that I find harder to shake than the court case. In the weeks after the explosion, a Galveston businessman named Sam Mascio organized a benefit for the survivors, and he pulled in Frank Sinatra, Phil Harris, and Ann Sheridan to perform it. The relief fund raised over $1 million. Ordinary people put more money in the hands of those families, faster, than the legal system managed in 8 years. I do not have a tidy thing to say about that. There is one line I cannot get out of my head, from the historian Hugh Stevens, who wrote the standard account of the disaster. He was trying to explain why nobody in that town had been worried, given that all the ingredients had been sitting in plain sight for years. He wrote that before the accident, Texas City's citizens felt secure because such a disaster had never happened, and they could therefore assume it never would. That is the whole thing right there. There is no villain in this story, and there is no broken valve. There was a port with nobody in charge of it. There was a chemical filed under 2 different names in 2 different government buildings. There was a captain who followed his training exactly, and a fire department that did its job perfectly. And there were several hundred people standing in the sun, watching a pretty orange cloud, because nobody had ever given them a reason to run. The Grandcamp's anchor is still lying in that field. 2 tons of iron, 1.5 miles from where the ship was tied up. Nobody ever went to prison. Nobody was ever found liable. The Fertilizer was on its way to feed Europe.